Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another in a series of webinars offered by BDO. My name is Jim Jeffries, and I serve as chairman of the M&A Leadership Council. And as many of you know, the council is made up of some of the world's best professional service firms who've come together to support the M&A community with the highest rated training programs that are offered today. BDO is the exclusive partner to the council overseeing transaction management and due diligence practices within the M&A lifecycle. Well, today's webinar will focus on what we refer to as the DMO, or the Diligence Management Office. I'm delighted to welcome Melissa Panagidis-Bush as our presenter in today's session. Hello, Melissa.
Hi, Jim. How are you? So happy to be here.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So good to have you. Listen, please tell us about the Diligence Management Office in this session and how it can improve our deal outcomes, not only for the diligence process, but also in the handoff to integration.
Good. Happy to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get started and talk a little bit about what a Diligence Management Office is, where it belongs in the integration, in the due diligence lifecycle, and how we can set it up for success, not only for the due diligence process, but also for eventual integration and recognizing the value of the acquisition. So as you see here, this is the generic structure of the due diligence and the whole acquisition process, if you will, starting with the letter of intent and getting ready for due diligence. And at this point in time is when you really want to think about putting together a diligence management office. And that office helps to manage the whole due diligence process and the transition to the integration management office as well. So by putting in a diligence management office early, you are able to create a structure that can help to really facilitate the move into integration and eventually stabilization and business as usual. So establishing the diligence office starts right at phase one. That's when you start having those conversations and really takes place over phase two during the due diligence and transaction management period. So one of the questions that we get when we do our wonderful one of the questions that we get when we do our workshops, and I hope that everyone will be here on the webinar will be joining us at one of the fantastic MALC workshops, is, you know, we address this, we ask the audience for feedback, and one of the things that somebody asked me one time, another management office? Really? We already have project management offices. We have lots of management offices in our organization. Why on earth would we want to have another management office? Well, I think that's a great question, and this quote to me, which is one of my absolute favorite quotes in the project management world, really speaks to me on why you want to put together a management office. So this talks about the why most projects fail. And this is a slide, and this quote came from NASA, and it was I think this was done somewhere in the 80s, where NASA really took after the Challenger disaster, NASA took a really hard look at how they were managing projects and what the success variables were, you know, what were the challenges that project managers had. And overall, when you're trying to achieve something, whether it's building a rocket ship or, in our case, managing through an acquisition, it's a project. It's a one-time thing that you're working through. The seeds of failure, when you go back and look at why something didn't work, the seeds of failure are often, the seeds of problems are laid down early. Initial planning is the most vital part of the project. And I have found that to be very, very true, and particularly in acquisitions and due diligence. In part because so many things can go wrong, not that they always do. In part because diligence is always happening while other things are happening. For the folks who are working on the diligence process, they're often having to do that in addition to their current jobs, whether it's checking things out, looking in the data room, trying to make decisions about whether or not this is a good idea, is done in the context of all these other things that are happening. So often it's sort of a failure to plan that can lead to problems. And by having a diligence management office, you really set down and lay out the seeds for positive impact and ultimately success in due diligence. So just to make this point a little bit more, common due diligence challenges, when you look at them, and I'm sure we could add, if I were live, I'd ask you to add more challenges, but these are some of the challenges that have been generated over time with our groups. So poorly managed process, right? If you have a diligence effort and it's not clear, you see kind of seeds of this throughout this slide. You see that poorly defined roles and responsibilities. I talked about competing priorities, big issue when you're trying to manage diligence. Weak decision-making process, and that's not because people aren't doing their job. It might be that that no one knows who's supposed to make the decision or who has the authority to make a decision. Lack of sufficient prioritization that goes to the competing priorities, because often in diligence there is a deadline or something has to happen at a certain time, and you may be working with folks who aren't always in the diligence process in your organization, and you need to help them know when something is a priority versus what is a nice to have. Insufficient resources, funding and personnel. Again, this goes to sort of the scarcity sometimes that we have when we're managing a diligence process, because it's, again, happening while everything else is happening. Team weaknesses, stakeholder conflict, all of these are elements that can really challenge a due diligence, can really affect the outcome of due diligence. And because we know this, in my mind, why not put in place the structure that can facilitate the process? And that is the Diligence Management Office. So what you see here is a generic structure. For those of you who have worked with project management organizations or other management organizations will recognize the structure. We are taking the best of project management, the best in organizational, operational design, and applying it here to the due diligence effort. And we're doing that by utilizing a structure that is proven over and over again to be very, very effective in managing complex, time-bound efforts, of which, of course, a diligence is absolutely that. So, typical structure here. So we have to have strong executive management. The responsibilities, typically in our diligence management office, we have oversight and direction by some sort of steering committee. Usually that's made up of executives or key functional VPs. I have one that I'm working with right now where we have the executive, and then we have executives of the business that's managing the acquisition, and on the steering committee we have executives of other business units that aren't perhaps directly involved with this acquisition, but they are part of the whole organization, and their perspective is very important, and it's good to have them on board and knowledgeable about what's happening in this acquisition. So the composition of the committee really is driven by the needs of the situation and the nature of the deal. Then we have the Diligence Management Office, and here sits usually a due diligence lead, and I'll get back to what the element or the requirements of an individual, because it's a very special role, really. And then underneath you see the functional leads and teams, and the functional leads here are the work streams. All these gray boxes, you can think of them as work streams. That's what we call them. I do have a client who likes to call them his nodes. I don't know why, but he likes the word nodes. So these little groupings here, work streams, are related to the key elements in an acquisition. So typically you're going to see HR, you're going to see IT, absolutely, finance, qualities of earnings, you know, legal, operations. These are the areas that will be most impacted by an acquisition, depending, again, on the nature of the transaction. You may see special work streams in there. A good example is I was working on a diligence, and there was a big environmental component, and so we had an individual, a specialized work stream, just looking at some of the environmental issues related to the acquisition. So you really want to pick the functional areas and that relate to the acquisition. And then you want to put in place leaders of those functional areas who have enough organizational purview and gravitas, perhaps, that they can actually get things done around diligence. These are the folks that you're going to go to, you know, take a look at the data room, fill out a form, complete a task. Certainly the folks who are in finance and legal, they may be more used to this. If you're a very acquisitive organization, if you've done this several times, you might know exactly who is responsible for that and who you need to go to. But if you're just doing this for perhaps the first time, or this is a new idea for your organization, you want to think about the person who will have the best, I don't know, access perhaps is the right word, to the organization and to the information, and be able to get it back to the diligence management office. So in the due diligence management office sits a diligence lead who oversees this whole effort. And typically this needs to be somebody who has a sense of, has enough presence with the executives, because this is the person that sits between the strong executives, right, the strong executive management team and all the functional leads. And so this is the person who is working with the executives to understand the strategy behind the acquisition, really needs to understand it because they communicate this to the functional leads often. The functional leads then report in to the management office on milestones and deliverables related to diligence. So typically the management office will put together a plan of action with deadlines and milestones and responsibilities, and then be working with the functional leads to make sure that all of these things get done and they're done on time. Another great, really great advantage of a diligence management office is you have one point of contact. So if you're sitting in audit or you're sitting in human resources and you're wondering where we are with the looking at insurance claims, if you don't know exactly who's going to be managing that in the insurance team, or who's managing that aspect of the question of the acquisition, you can go to the due diligence management office and get your answer. So you create one place where everything can reside. This is a good place for troubleshooting, and this is a place where you can really manage the risks and track the progress. The best thing, though, the best thing about the due diligence management office is the idea of white space. So often we find in diligence that there are things that we didn't think about. It's not on our list. This might be the first time we've brought two types of entities together, again, depending on your strategy. And as you start digging and trying to figure out what you need to know to make a decision about this acquisition, things are going to come up. And in the context of conversations with various work streams, or in the context of conversations with the executive committee, or perhaps your lawyer or whatever, there will be topics that don't quite fit in legal or audit or tax or IT, or that maybe they sit between these work streams, and it's usually the IMO. The IMO will flag it and deal with it. And I'll give you an example. So I was working on a diligence, and this is back to the one that had the high environmental needs, and it was because we had there was a pond out back on the property of the organization they were acquiring that had potentially, because of the functioning, the building that sat there had some runoff. So there was some concern about the potential for environmental contaminants in the pond. And in the course of a work stream meeting, it was pointed out to somebody that actually the land had never really been surveyed. We were talking about the pond, and it was actually, I think, somebody from the audit team who said, yeah, you know, I don't think I've ever seen the plat for this property. We don't have the survey, and it's not in the data room. So, and it was something that he had just sort of thought, nobody had thought about it. Everybody had assumed that we had everything we needed to understand the whole property, and we probably would have eventually had found this out. But because we were talking about the pond and because we were talking about the boundaries of the pond, we discovered sort of in this conversation that we had an important missing piece of information, and were able to request it and then find out that they needed to get it surveyed because it had never been surveyed before. It might seem small, it might not be a big issue, but it happened because we were together talking about the whole due diligence management process, and it was because we were there as part of the diligence management office taking a holistic look that we could find something like that, which ended up being pretty material in the whole transaction. So that's just a simple example of how the white space plays out, and it happens over and over again. And it really doesn't happen unless you have some sort of management office really orchestrating the whole process. Okay, so next, the functions of the DMO really are more than just to manage tasks and deliverables. There are some other really great benefits of having a diligence management office. First, injecting speed. And as we all know, especially if you've already been in the diligence process before, you're never going fast enough. Or you have to go really fast and then you have to wait because there's some period of, regulatory review, or there's something has to happen. So it might be hurry up and wait, or it's you rush to get something done, and then you think you're finished, and then there's all this other stuff that has to happen. So, but there is always a pressure of time. You want to get to a decision, and then you want to get to a letter, or you want to close the deal as quickly as possible. So one of the things that the management office really facilitates is the pacing and injecting speed, or in some cases even slowing things down if that's appropriate. But again, that's happening because you have a mechanism in the management office to really help with the pacing, which wouldn't happen if you were sort of doing it all across, there was no one sort of in charge of the whole thing. Connecting people. Again, I mentioned this before, creating a point of contact where you can go to a one-stop shop, ask questions, the management office can go find the answer, and vice versa. You're identifying points of contact within each of the functional areas that really become experts in what's going on in diligence. Creating structure. We use a lot of templates and tools in our management office. Again, if you're familiar with project management offices, it's not that different. These are just tailored to the diligence process. And the great thing is after we've done it a couple of times, our tools get really, really good. And so by the time we're moving into second, third, fourth diligence effort, we really have something that has tested and is tried and true, and we are familiar with it. There are obviously, in the diligence process, repeatable tasks, so it's good to have like a template or a list, or even sometimes I know for me, having managed due diligence management offices, I have emails that I save because that I can use again and again. I could just edit for the context, and again, it's a time saver, and it's nice to have that structure going in. Managing the process, I've talked about creating an oversight, making sure everyone has a cadence for meeting, those kinds of things, and then ultimately engineering success, identifying synergies, and coordinating with legal. So making sure that all of the issues that are getting you excited about this acquisition are really discussed and leveraged, and so, but helping you ask the right questions so you get to the right answers. Okay. And finally, well, not finally, again, I should say, we also manage risks and issues. So in any situation, like when you're working on due diligence, there's always going to be risks, right? Not only to the organization, but to the whole process. And again, the Due Diligence Management Office is a really great tool for helping to mitigate and maybe control some of the risk. Obviously, you don't get it doesn't go away, but it becomes a structure that you can use to really facilitate conversation and protect yourself a little bit around some of the risks of the risks to your success. So communication, again, by having this structure in place, you have a way, an avenue of communication. It actually becomes the job of the Due Diligence Management Office to create a structure for communicating around diligence. And that in and of itself is huge. Roles and responsibilities, again, very, very important. So if I went back, if you remember that slide, one of the challenges to due diligence is lack of definition on roles and responsibilities. So, and I'm sure many of you have seen this where, you know, well, who's doing that? Is that your job or my job? Or, oh no, legal has that. And I don't think legal has that. I think actually, you know, environment has that, or tax has that, or who's, I mean, there are the big things in diligence, and then there are all the little things. And sometimes it's those little things that can get you. And by really talking about who's going to do what by when, having some clarity around that, it relieves some of the unnecessary stress around diligence. Interdependencies, we talked about white space, I won't repeat that. And then project management, again, having a structure in place that's helping you to control, plan diligence effort, control it, and then monitor it for execution. And then providing the tools and the methods so that we can get that done. So you aren't making it up as you go, that you have a structured, orderly way to move through what can be always a very tumultuous thing, which is diligence. So this is an example, just a little example. I have lots of examples, but we only have 20 minutes. So here's an example of a tool that you can use that really can be leveraged by something like a diligence management office that really helps to set the stage and frame the whole diligence process. So this is defining urgency. So part of what happens in diligence is people are looking through a lot of information to try to inform a process, and it really is very helpful if you come out ahead of time and say, hey, if something is urgent, we want to know about that right away. But if something, you know, looks like it might be a risk, it might be a moderate or low, you know, we can wait for that for one of our weekly meetings, or you can just call me independently. Well, the question, of course, is going to be, well, what do you mean by urgent? Like, how would I know what's urgent? Now, some of it's obvious. This is probably an extreme example, but if you uncover a violation of the law or our own company policy as you're reviewing materials for diligence, that's probably pretty high. Or if you come across something that in your gut says this is going to delay our close because this is a huge issue, that's going to go right to the top. Usually, however, things like that are a little more subtle and are driven by the type of transaction that's going down and the kind of diligence that's happening. So having a diligence management office that can help to upfront, and even during, but mostly upfront, define what some of the parameters are, of course, in consultation with the steering committee. Usually that's something that's reviewed with the steering committee. And then when you have your kickoff meeting for diligence, and usually I bring all of the work streams together, this is the kind of thing we would go over. And we really get to helping the folks who are going to be doing the boots on the ground, who are going to really be looking through management, looking through all of the management materials. We're going to help them do their job a little bit better by giving them the guide rails that they need to do a good job. We're not just casting them out there. We're just saying, here's what you need to know. Here's what we think we want to look for. These are the parameters for something that's urgent versus something that's not urgent. And then this is when you can also remind them to the whole so what. So what if ask yourself, you know, is this material to the transaction? Because you'll find all kinds of things, right? But helping folks have a little bit of guiding folks to what's important, what might be critical, and what to look for. Because usually there's a sense for that when you're going into due diligence. You're excited about this organization for a reason. There might be some doubts or some concerns. Those are the kinds of things you can put out there in advance. And the management office is a good way to manage that information. So, best practices. I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to help you if you establish a diligence management office. It really does. Hopefully, I've made the case that it will organize people and processes. It will really help to crystallize the whole effort and ensure that as you move through diligence, you're focusing on the right things. You're working smart, not just working hard. It also, what's really important in the whole diligence process is to dedicate the right resources. And again, by having a diligence management office, you have resources. You not only have dedicated resources, but you have them in specific roles with clear roles and responsibilities. Another great is the bias towards inclusion. Again, if you have a good management office lead, part of their job is to make sure you're asking all the right questions of all the right people and including people as much as possible, making sure that the integration leaders are aware of what's coming to them, making sure that we are telegraphing as much as we can what the possibility down the road is going to be after the diligence, really laying the groundwork for success after the due diligence process, assuming everything goes well. We also suggest that developing those prioritized checklists. Again, that can be the diligence management office becomes a repository for those checklists. And I cannot emphasize enough how wonderful it is as you're starting a new diligence process is to dust off a file and find all of these great checklists that are really going to start you off on the process and, and remind you of all of the things that have to get done and when they have to get done so that you can tailor it to your current process. And then facilitating the face-to-face communication. Again, what a great way to do that through the diligence management office. That's part of their job, is making sure that folks are able to talk in real time and have a meaningful conversation about what's going on, what they're seeing, in a way to manage the white space, and making sure that everybody's clear on why we're doing this, and then ultimately, when we would need to walk away. And that conversation happens and is facilitated by the diligence management office. So I think that's it. Yes, we are very excited to have the Art of M&A Due Diligence in October in Scottsdale. I hope that you will join us. We will learn. We'll go a little bit more into the some of the better experiences around due diligence management offices, but also we'll talk about failures. We'll talk about when M&A hasn't worked and when diligence has been a problem and what we can learn from those mistakes and how we can translate that into positive learning for us as we think about how we manage the whole due diligence process. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in Scottsdale.
Listen, Melissa, thanks so much for doing this for us today. And I also want to invite everyone to join us in October in Scottsdale. We'll be at the beautiful Hyatt Regency there. Many of you that are on this call, I'm sure, have attended some of our workshops. We've now trained well over 2,000 M&A executives in everything from, obviously, the strategy through due diligence, integration, IT, HR, and a number of other things. But I also want to highlight very quickly, you're not only going to hear about financial and how to run a DMO, we're going to dive deeply into operations, culture, how about cybersecurity? And then also the tools, the various techniques, and how about new technologies that are being leveraged today to better manage and operate the diligence management office through the full integration in the IMO. So listen, we're excited. Melissa, great job. Thank you very much for doing this today. And thank you, everyone, for being on this call.